This is Delhi. Please stand by for the next broadcast. This is All India Radio. In the national program tonight, we bring you a feature that traces India's journey through its evolving architecture, from the first stirrings for freedom to where a young nation finds its own voice. The feature is titled, Where the Skyline Scripts History.
16th August 1947, Delhi. The flag of a free nation goes up and flutters proudly against the sky. In ecstasy, we are free. The flag flutters above the red sandstone ramparts of the mighty Red Fort. The fortified walls of this splendid monument are witness to many a story. Of the building and destruction of cities and palaces, of the rise and fall of two empires, the Mughal and the British. Delhi was the center of that early battle for freedom in 1857, and the Red Fort was spectator to how it swung this way and that till Mughal glory was crushed beneath British boots. The builders of a great empire needed to establish their authority on Indian soil, to make their presence seen and felt. This is how they did it, through architecture, to leave a mark on Indian skies. Abha Lamba, a well-known conservation architect, tells us how 1857 became a watershed year for the subcontinent's architecture.
Before 1857, it was the East India Company that was building all the great edifices, and it was purely as a matter of a European trading company coming in, trying to impress the natives with the might and grandeur of neoclassical architecture, which was, in a sense, a bit of a copy of a textbook, pictures, postcards of what they would see back home. So you have St. Martin in the Fields at Trafalgar Square replicated in St. Andrew's Church, or such copies of the town hall. It happened in Calcutta, in Madras and in Bombay, with the town halls being sort of a Greek neoclassical face to them. Then post 1857, there was a big shift. One direction assumed that the Britishers were now the upholders of the empire, and right after the Mughals, they were heirs to the Indian throne. So there was a conscious effort to orientalize architecture, and therefore we have the Indo-Saracenic architecture evolving. And the other stream went purely very British in the Neo-Gothic style. And what was high Victorian in England, they represented the new structures in a purely Victorian Neo-Gothic style, which is then seen in the Victoria Terminus, the Bombay University, and other such structures.
The hill stations were born from an immediate need for sanatoriums for the troops and boarding schools for British children. A description from novelist Ruskin Bond, who has lived through it all.
Well, our hill stations, most of them came up in the 1820s, 1830s. The British thought they would be good places to have a sort of convalescent depots for invalided troops or soldiers, as well as civil sort of rest stations where families could be sent during the hot summer months. So you would get very often a hill station like, say, Missouri, which has a cantonment attached, which started as a sort of military establishment. And then you had the civil station, which spread out in the other direction. Now, Simla, of course, was different in that it became the summer capital. So you'll find the similar architecture really quite British in that it's the government buildings are sort of Georgian-style edifices, and whereas in perhaps hill stations like Mussoorie or Nainital or Darjeeling, which were not so official. So the houses came up more or less as summer homes. And then in almost every hill station, the center of social activity was the Mall.
The summer capital of the British Raj was in Shimla. The skyline there portrays a picture of authority too. Raja Paseen, a well-known historian, describes the distinctive architecture of the Institute for Advanced Studies, which was built as the Viceregal Lodge.
Broadly speaking, it comes under what is considered to be the Scottish baronial style of architecture, but it does not follow a strict architectural style. There is Dutch Burger, there is oriel windows, there are touches of Tudor, there are touches of English Renaissance, but the overall architecture can be classed as Scottish baronial. The highlights of this style are, one is of the stonework, and the other thing is the buttresses and the mock fortifications that have been placed on top of it. Being the residence as well as the offices of the Viceroy of India, practically every major decision taken while the government was in Simla was somehow taken here because the Viceroy was living here. Apart from that, the 2 or 3 very major events that took place, such as the 2 Simla conferences which were held in the 1940s, then several discussions leading to the partition of India were also held in this building.
It is interesting that long before independence, from the early 1900s, there was an attempt to bring in an Oriental touch to buildings in India. The works of garrison engineers was not becoming of rulers. Eminent architect K.T. Ravindran tells us more.
There was already a search for what can be very broadly or loosely called Indian identity. For instance, in the Banaras Hindu University, it was being sought as a kind of Hinduized takeoff, the Indo-Saracenic style, which had become popular during the early 1900s. I think the first building was done in 1909. They built the Dehradun Academy. They built other forest research centers in Coimbatore, etc. From that evolved what is called the Indo-Saracenic style, which is actually not a very correct term because it has nothing to do with Saracens, which are a tribe in Afghanistan. But however, the style came to be known that way, and it was an eclectic mixture of what can be called broadly belonging to the subcontinent, that is Hindu, Islamic and Buddhist architectural styles mixed with Gothic architecture. So it is a kind of a hybrid style which was sought to be identified with institutions in India. There was a number of buildings were conceived at the time, mainly institutional buildings, which are kind of para-governmental organizations like hospitals, universities, research centers, postal buildings, etc. were being done in that style, while hardcore governance was done from buildings which are designed on pure British style. So there was a distinct shift from the garrison engineers architecture, which was actually from a book which was brought from the UK and was transferred to the Indian soil.
From December 1911, New Delhi was the hub of governmental activity, the commanding center of power. The architects chosen to design this new city were Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker. One of the main building contractors was Sir Shobha Singh. In this archival recording, Khushwant Singh, famous journalist and son of Sir Shobha Singh, says,
they gave it external resemblance to Indian architecture. The 3 things they chose was a sunbreaker, the chhajja, window, jali, and then a dome, which they call the chhatri. So you have these external things which resemble Oriental architecture, but the rest was almost entirely British. Because they said the concept of law and order which the British brought should be exhibited in the style of the buildings which they were making.
This is All India Radio, Delhi, radiating on all transmitters. We are now taking you over to the Durbar Hall for a running commentary connected with the assumption of power.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge.
An important landmark of the new capital was Broadcasting House. This distinguished Art Deco building connected India within and to the rest of the world through airwaves. Dhruv Narayan Chaudhary frequented the place because his father was then the talks officer at the News Services Division of All India Radio.
This building of All India Radio was the first modern building on Parliament Street. The rest of it were only bungalows. Whoever came after 43 or 44 to Delhi, all the visitors thought of visiting this building along with Red Fort, Qutub Minar. It is probably the first building which had to do something with media revolution, which radio really triggered off in the late 30s and particularly in early 40s. Those double pillars and those 3 towers with a central tower in between housing all the offices and the studios in a semicircle which kept off the sound from the road. Of course, not that there was much sound, because when we used to walk up from Connaught Place to this side, we could hardly see 3 or 4 cars in an hour. And the other interesting point is, instead of stone, as suggested earlier, this was built entirely with bricks, because shifting so much of stones during war years would have been very difficult and also would have put up the cost. I happened to walk into this building right back somewhere in July 1943. I mean, within a few months after this building was inaugurated. Now, you may ask me, why did I have to do that at the age of 10? It was because my father, the illustrious author, Dr. Niraj C. Chaudhary, was the talks officer of All India Radio.
Freedom came at a colossal cost of blood, sweat and tears, of countless lives snuffed out at the gallows or brutally terrorized in monstrous prison cells for life.
In the Empire versus Aurobindo Ghosh and others case, I pronounce Aurobindo Ghosh not guilty due to lack of concrete evidence linking him to the conspiracy. I pronounce Baran Ghosh and Ulaskar Dutt guilty and sentence them to death by hanging. Sazai Mort. 13 others accused in this case: Upendranath Banerjee, Vibhuti Bhushan Sarkar, Rishikesh Kanjilal, Birendra Sen, Sudhir Sarkar, Indra Nundi, Avinash Bhattacharya, Soilendra Bose, Hem Chandra Das, Indubhushan Roy, Paresh Malik, Shishir Ghosh, Nirapati Roy are pronounced guilty and sentenced to transportation for life. Sazai Kalapani.
Kalapani, across the black waters. The name itself sent shivers down the spine of young revolutionaries and political dissenters. Far away from their fancy cities, the British built penal settlements for its rebels, right from 1857, where their nationalist feelings could be crushed, their spirits broken. The Cellular Jail at Andaman and Nicobar Islands was designed to incarcerate political prisoners in complete isolation, to prevent exchange of ideas, to suppress increasing discontent against the ruling dispensation. Professor Manoj Mathur of the School of Planning and Architecture elaborates on the diabolical design of the jail.
So the way these jail cells have been laid out are like the spokes of a wheel. And at the hub of this wheel is where the control is exercised. So the person who's supervising everybody here sits at the hub of this wheel in a way that there is absolutely clear sight lines. You can see what is happening down each of the spokes. The system is called the panopticon. Panopticon means to be able to see everywhere. And there is one very peculiar thing about it, which is that in each of these spokes, which have got the cells arranged in a row, one side of the cells there is a corridor or a passageway down which the sentry would walk. But in the next spoke, what you would see across the corridor would not be another corridor of the other spoke, but instead you would be seeing a complete blank wall with few holes in it. And those holes, when you saw them through your barred doors, would remind you that there, behind that, is another person who's suffering just like you, but you cannot communicate with each other to alleviate each other's suffering.
सरफरोशी की तमन्ना अब हमारे दिल में देखना है जोर कितना बाजुए कातिल में भारत अनोखा राग है.
Our first Prime Minister, filled with the euphoria of freedom, wanted to show the world a new India, a smart India, away from the crowded hustle and bustle of the then typical Indian cities, of smart buildings full of air and light and open spaces. Says Professor K.T. Ravindran.
The 1947 to 60 period, as we know, our polity was dominated by the towering personality of Jawaharlal Nehru, and his mindset and ideology actually led to a certain kind of modernism being brought into India at that time. And he strongly backed Le Corbusier, who had come here to design Chandigarh, who also did buildings in Ahmedabad at that time. He also set up a strong wing of architecture and design in the CPWD, which was at that time headed by Habib Rahman, who designed the Rabindra Bhavan at Mandi House in Delhi, which is a path-breaking building, because for the first time in that building, modernist idiom in architecture, which was prevalent all over the world, was tweaked into a kind of Indianness, as well as it created a new vocabulary for institutional design.
New institutions of education, art, culture sprang up, where there could be free flow and exchange of ideas, where expansive thinking could take place. Earlier in 1936, Rukmini Devi Arundale started Kalakshetra, a dance academy in the south of India, which brought the traditional dance form of Bharatanatyam out of the temples to revive this beautiful art form and present it to the world. The academy, by the sea, lies in nature's lap, its buildings made of indigenous material merging with the environs. At the beginning of the 20th century, Rabindranath Tagore had already visualized his Vishwabharati University and his abode of peace, Shantiniketan. His thinking was global. He wanted all the world to come together under the open skies to share each other's thoughts and traditions seamlessly. He invited Mahatma Gandhi to visit him.
Interestingly, because of the proximity of the Baul traditions around Tagore, he was also very drawn to the rural architecture. At the same time, his artists were going to Ajanta Ellora and making sketches and drawings, and there was a lot of stylistic mixture that was taking place between folk traditions, classical traditions, and a distinct rural stream. That was also the time when Gandhi was experimenting with very purely rural mud architecture. He moved in 1936 from Sabarmati Ashram to Wardha, and in Wardha he acquired a small building which was already under construction in bamboo and mud, which has come to be later known as Bapukuti, and he moved into Bapukuti. The India that he foresaw coming forward after independence, this is a good 11 years before independence, but they were already imagining a new India. In Gandhi's imagination, it would be a completely rural India. That is, villages will become the production centers and the cities and towns will become the clearinghouses for the village produce. Interestingly, it was in 1936 that Tagore also built his Shamali, and he took very strong references to the Santal traditions in building as well as in construction techniques. And this was also the building in which Gandhi and Tagore met. So there was a confluence of two of these village-centric minds coming together at that time in history. It's really remained a mystery to me, kind of a mystery of history, that a movement like that never really took off.
Architecture must be rooted in the soil in which it grows, stressed the late Charles Correa, one of the foremost architects of modern India.
Architecture is not a movable art, a portable art like music. A building is rooted in its soil and in the materials and in the technology and in the culture and the climate, etc. And that is also true of cities. There was a time when a city grew naturally, just like we have Varanasi. And then we have now the transplants coming from somewhere else and deforming these cities. So it used to be that a city like Manila or Bombay or Singapore was what you might call a port town, a coastal town, and it had its own form. And then you have another kind of city which was inland and cold and, and it had enclosed buildings and stuff. And they were mostly in Europe and Northern Europe. And the irony is that those models from Northern Europe and America are coming and filling these beautiful places which had quite a different typology and a different ethos. So please, we must understand what is at stake. In fact, there's a wonderful phrase of Churchill, a person I'm not mad about, but this is one thing he said which is fantastic. He said, "We build our buildings and then our buildings build us."
The architects design the buildings, the cities, but it is the people of the soil who toil to make them. Who thinks of their shelters, their homes? Always a cluster of shacks at the building sites. We travel back in time to the 1920s with this archival recording of Khushwant Singh's.
There was a little miniature railway which ran from Badarpur right across up to nearly Connaught Circus, called the Imperial Delhi Railway, which brought sand and stones and others and deposited them at their sites. The contractor's part came later. They got the labor, largely Bagdis from Rajasthan, and they were Sangtarash, master masons, generally descendants of the people who built the Taj. We families who were involved in building the city, we lived on what is then called Old Mill Road, which ran along the circle outside Parliament House, where the mosque and Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed's grave is, along for a few hundred yards. These Bagdis, who were paid 8 annas a day for the man and 6 annas for a woman. That was the total salary, apart from being given free accommodation, means juggies, and drinking water. They ate only unleavened bread eaten with raw salt or pepper or red chilies. These people, having done all this work in the evening, they'd go back, one heard them all the Bagri women with their gararas floating, singing lustily, going along the road back to their juggis, while our families who made money out of what they were doing were quarreling over vahi khata, kitna hua kaam, kitna nahi hua, kitna, that kind of thing. And soon the builders became prosperous and they built themselves big houses on what is now Jantar Mantar Road.
There is a generation of Indian architects who have the common man in mind, who build at low cost and fulfill their needs. An architect couple, Rajan and Chitra Kiri, helped rebuild Bhuj after the devastating Gujarat earthquake of 2001. Their daughter, Parul Kiri Roy, herself an associate professor at the School of Planning and Architecture, recalls.
Dad started realizing that there is a need to create spaces which would come together for the people all over again. So it was not so much about just, rebuilding people's homes, but it was also about rebuilding people's lives afresh. For people in the village, it's not so much the internal spaces that are of great importance, it's also the outside space. So while it had the comfort of having a couple of rooms and space for cooking, it would also have the space for the cattle or the sheep. What he did put in there was the toilet. People, they were in denial because it was not really according to their cultural habits at that time. But he kind of insisted that no, toilets are a really important feature in your homes, so you should have them.
Spiritualism has been the hallmark of India down the ages. It was this inner strength which propelled our freedom fighters. Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo have left their mark in the skies of Belur in West Bengal and Auroville in Puducherry. The underlying principle of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings was the brotherhood of man. Swami Vivekananda wanted this idea to be built into the temple of Sri Ramakrishna at Belur on the banks of the river Hooghly. The sanctum here is connected to the prayer hall by a vestibule which resembles a church. The arched ceiling, hanging balconies, and 2 rows of stately pillars are reminiscent of Buddhist caves. The windows and arches are of the Rajput and Mughal styles. The Matri Mandir at Auroville emerges as a large golden sphere which seems to be rising from the earth, symbolizing the birth of a new consciousness. It tracks and projects each ray of the sunlight throughout the day into a crystal globe inside the inner chamber, the meditation room, where you focus on life, the maker, and the universality of man. Revati Kamath, a pioneer of mud architecture, perhaps shared the sentiments of Tagore and Gandhi. She has built spaces for the marginalized, spent time with them, seen the relationship between their chula and the charpoi, measured distances with the hand and the fingers as they did, remembering their village homes. She has, in the smallest of spaces, made a home for them, the migrant laborer under the bridge.
वो नक्शा बनाया तो उसी में हमने ऐसा सोचा और रेवती जी ने सलाह भी दी हमारे को तो खुद ही बनाओ तो आपके हिसाब से कि भाई ऐसा बनना चाहिए उसी हिसाब से खुद बनाओ तो उसमें अच्छा रहेगा और हमने सोचा कि भाई हम खुद बनाएंगे अच्छा अच्छा घर बनाएंगे हमारे जो मन की बात है वो हमारी पूरी होगी.
Revati Kamath has also built a village in Rajasthan. She used the labor of the villagers. Their own art adorned their homes. The women and men put in all their traditional inputs. They worked together to complete a dream village. Revati used soil, wood and bamboo as her building material. To her, there are 2 kinds of architecture. Biophilic, which works in relationship with nature, and the consumeristic.
To me, nature is the totality of life. It's really everything, because, what we breathe out, the tree breathes in, what the tree breathes out, we breathe in. Absolutely, we are one with it. So it really is a part of the human continuum. So it is really to see how the land and the human being can establish a symbiotic relationship, and one should not be at the cost of the other.
In the national program, you just heard a feature titled Where the Skyline Scripts History. Script and narration was by Indrani Roy Misra. Additional voicing was by Manoj Mainkar. The feature was researched and produced by Basudha Banerji with assistance in production from Shamaita Das. a presentation of the Central English Features Unit. This broadcast came to you from the Delhi station of All India Radio.